nights you're out at the old ball game. Take me out to the ball game. Take me out with the crowd. Buy me some peanuts and Cracker Jacks.
The Cardinal organization and people like we have behind me, it's a pleasure. I get to do this on an everyday basis. I get to rub shoulders with Jimmy Edmonds and Willie McGee when they were playing, okay? And all of the great Cardinals that have come along. And a guy from St. Louis, born and reared here, you know, I think this is my city, my state, and my Cardinals.
Baseball fans everywhere are mourning the loss of St. Louis Cardinals star Mike Shannon, who died Saturday at the age of 83.
And when it comes to the game of baseball and the St. Louis region, we really have always enjoyed an embarrassment of riches where you can hardly walk down the street without bumping into somebody of legendary status. And this morning, we have one icon talking about another icon, and whatever is beyond the definition of icon, this is what these men represent. And Bob Costas, welcome to the Big 550. Thank you for being here today.
Morning, Bob.
Hi, Wendy. Hi, Jennifer.
What was your earliest personal memory of Mike Shannon? Was it as the kid in Syracuse with a transistor, or was it here in St. Louis?
It was way before any of that. 12 years old, 1964 World Series, and I'm rooting for the Yankees. This is before I became an adopted St. Louisan, and I still think of St. Louis now as my hometown. But I'm 12 years old, living on Long Island. I'm rooting for Mickey Mantle and the Yankees against Mike Shannon, Lou Brock, Bob Gibson, and the Cardinals. So my first recollection is, and this is a true story, I would never go to school if the Yankees were in the World Series. Every World Series game was in the daytime then. And my mom would want to send me to school, and my father, correctly, I don't know if he was prescient or he just liked baseball, one or the other, he will remember this longer than he'll remember whatever they're teaching in school today. So on weekdays, he would let me stay home and watch the World Series on a black and white TV. So the first recollection I have is in Game 1 of the 1964 World Series, Mike Shannon hit a titanic home run off the the Yankee Hall of Famer, Whitey Ford. And I think it hit the eagle. There was an Anheuser-Busch sign beyond the bleachers in left center field in the old Sportsman's Park, and I think it hit the eagle, one of the most titanic home runs. So I remember that. I remember the 64 series. I remember the 67 and 68 series when I was still in high school. Then when I came to St. Louis in 1974, I mean, I knew all about his playing career. I wasn't that familiar with him as a broadcaster, and he was early on in his tenure as Jack Buck's sidekick at that point. And what I remember is just how nice he was, how warm and welcoming he was. And there was always that regular guy aspect about him, no pretense of any kind, no self-consciousness. You know, if I make a mistake on a broadcast, I'm still thinking about it a year later. Mm-hmm. Mike made a few mistakes. It was part of what endeared him to his audience. He forgot about it in the next millisecond.
So
he just
true.
didn't carry around any of that self-doubt. And that's part of what made him, A, someone who was able to embrace life and enjoy it to the fullest, and B, a genuine and therefore endearing person.
You mentioned Lou Brock. You mentioned Bob Gibson and Tim McCarver. This is quite a bit of loss, all sort of grouped together. I know that isn't lost on you. What does it represent to you, Bob, though?
Well, baseball is different from other sports. It has the richest history and the most meaningful traditions, and baseball in St. Louis personifies that. It's one of the few remaining towns where even if there was an NFL team, baseball is still the most important. And Cardinal history is so rich, and part of that history is the voices that brought it to people. Harry Carey and Jack Buck and Joe Garagiola for a while, and Milo Hamilton, who was with several teams, but he's also in the broadcaster's wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame, as Joe Buck will be someday. And now with Skip Carey coming back to St. Louis to broadcast the games on television. That's a connection to his grandfather. So those voices are an inescapable part of your memories. Baseball is a day-in, day-out game. And until relatively recently, if we look at the whole history of baseball, it's been primarily a radio game. Mm-hmm. And if you'll forgive me on your air mentioning KMOX with its 50,000 watts and the Cardinals' wide-reaching regional fan base with all those affiliates, and for a very long time, St. Louis was the southernmost and the westernmost city in all of Major League Baseball before expansion. So the Cardinals were truly a regional franchise. All those things tie it together. So even if you're not an avid fan, even if you're not reading all the box scores and you don't know all the minutia, those voices, most certainly including Mike Shannon, were part of your life if you're a St. Louisan.
That is so true, Bob. And you mentioned how nice Mike Shannon was to you. Do you have some favorite memories professionally?
Well, I was doing the morning sportscast. Bob Hardy and Rex Davis anchored the mornings on KMOX, and I'm just a wet behind the ears kid. And I played a clip from a brawl the night before. Somebody was hit by a pitch and walked toward the mound, but no punches were thrown. And I played the clip from the KMOX broadcast, and then I must have said something like, well, in the end, it didn't amount to much. And Mike sounded very excited in the clip. And I didn't realize at that point, I had no intention to slight Mike or anybody else, but Mike felt that I was questioning his credibility. And so I was at the ballpark the next night, and he came up to me, and he was a very imposing physical figure. and he said, he expressed his displeasure. He wasn't yelling at me, but, don't do that, et cetera, et cetera. And then he capped it, however, with a pat on the shoulder. Everybody says you're doing a great job.
Wow.
Yep.
And then he remarked to people, because this is one of the things that writers need to do and broadcasters need to do. If you said something that didn't come out the right way and you regret it, or it's a criticism, you don't regret it, but you can't hide. You need to show up the next day or the nearest possibility when to face the person. You need to do that. So I guess I did that. It just seemed to me like it was what you should do. I was 22, 23 years old, and he remembered that and remarked on it to other people. Like he was a stand-up guy. He didn't hide. And I think that just shows what a stand-up guy he was.
No doubt about it, Bob. Players have always ended up on the other side of the glass, on the other side of the microphone, as you mentioned. But what was it about him as a broadcaster? And I know we only have you for a brief time, but what was it that made him so unique? What was it that the fact that he didn't have a curated image, the fact that there was no mask?
Yeah, I mean, he certainly wasn't a graduate of the Columbia School of Broadcasting.
Oh, no.
But here's the thing. He wasn't trying to be Jack Buck. Or for that matter, even Harry Carey, who in his own way was a bombastic personality. He wasn't trying to be Vin Scully or any of those other people who are in the broadcaster's wing of the Baseball Hall of Fame. He was completely and totally and unaffectedly Mike Shannon. But what he brought to the booth was a very keen eye for baseball, a very deep understanding of the game, and his relationships with people. He was always at the batting cage, in the dugout, in the clubhouses, including the visitors, not just the Cardinals, including the visitors. Everybody in baseball knew him. They would confide in him, and he brought that knowledge to the booth. Most of us bring notes and preparation. His preparation was the life he had lived in baseball. He'd sit down. He might look at the game notes that the PR department put out, but basically just looked at the lineup, and he called the game. And his broadcasts were filled with baseball insights. Toward the end, as he was getting older and he had a tough battle with long COVID, obviously he wasn't quite the same. But through most of his career, he was a very keen baseball observer. And even though we joke about his malaprops, and there were plenty of them, and they're part of who he was.
Yeah.
It wasn't like you heard it and said, "Oh, geez, this is awful." You heard it and said, "This is great."
Exactly.
This is so funny.
Exactly.
But what that could obscure was when you listen to a montage of his best calls, Glenn Brummer stealing home, I think it was in '82, or any of the great moments for the great Cardinals in their pennant-winning years, those calls are pretty darn good.
You may have already answered the question in terms of the fabric of the region, but this is this does feel like a loss on a molecular level, Bob. Everybody felt that they were Mike Shannon's buddy. Everybody felt that they were a part of his life, and that is a gift, isn't it?
Yes, it is. He's part of the fabric, just as Jack Buck was, part of the fabric of life in St. Louis, even if you're not an avid baseball fan. Perhaps the name Craig Hawksley rings a bell. The late Craig Hawksley passed away a few years ago. Very funny guy from Webster Groves. And he had a pitch-perfect Mike Shannon imitation, and which he would pepper with amusing asides that plausibly, he made them up, but plausibly Mike could have said those things. and so I invited him to come to the Fox Theater for one of the Cardinal Glennon fundraisers that we did. I think he was opening for Jerry Seinfeld or some comedian of that stature. But Craig's Shannon imitation went over so well in St. Louis. You got, 4,000 plus people in the Fox Theater, and not all of them know everything about baseball, but there wasn't a single person there that didn't immediately recognize Mike Shannon's voice and got the whole idea. This is who Mike Shannon is, local and regional treasure. If you took Mike Shannon, and this is almost unimaginable, if you took Mike Shannon and said, well, the tide has turned and twists and turns of life, and now you're the voice of the Seattle Mariners. It wouldn't play because the connection wouldn't be there. If you said to Joe Buck, again, this is kind of unimaginable because he has this gigantic network career, but if Joe Buck was to go become the announcer for the Philadelphia Phillies, he'd be great because that's pure broadcasting talent. But with Mike, it had to be, a huge percentage of it was his connection to St. Louis. He was an all-state star, three sports, basketball, football, baseball at CBC. He played freshman football at Mizzou, and Frank Broyles, Hall of Fame coach, said that if he stuck with football, he might have won the Heisman Trophy. So he's a St. Louis guy through and through. He has the pedigree of being on the 3 pennant-winning teams in the 60s. Then he's in the booth with Jack Buck, and he's in that booth for half a century. So you can't separate out just the calls themselves like you're conducting a broadcasting clinic. Those calls are infused for the audience with all the understanding, all the texture of his connection to the Cardinals.
But the Cardinals, the sports, the icons, what is it about this town? And this is not, this is not just bias. I know that obviously there are communities that have the same kind of connections, but you don't usually have a Bob Costas standing next to a Jack Buck, standing next to a Dan Deerdorf, standing next, the list goes on and on. What was it about St. Louis, Bob?
Well, as a baseball town, there are very few that can match it. And what sets it apart, even among those few, New York, Boston, Cub fans in Chicago, is the combination of passion and civility that you find in St. Louis, a place where opposing players get appreciative ovations, and where even guys who aren't going to the Hall of Fame, but they were good players for a period of time for the Cardinals, then they come back. Colton Wong, Matt Carpenter, the appreciative cheers that they get. There's just something more good-natured about baseball in St. Louis. I think it's fair to say Cub fans have that too, but something just good-natured about the relationship between the Cardinals and the city. And it wouldn't have played as well if the Cardinals weren't so successful, generally speaking, and didn't have so many Hall of Fame players and memorable personalities and so many tremendous voices to bring those games to the fans.
Well, and Bob, we are so grateful to you because along the same lines and the same bolt of cloth, you never say no. You are always incredibly generous with your time, and there was nobody else we wanted to talk to. So thank you for saying yes. We know you've got back-to-back interviews today, but we're thinking of you, and Cart, that everybody who loves baseball and sports is thinking of Mike Shannon. And
absolutely. Let me leave you with just a couple of my favorite Shannon moments that go into the malaprop file. And none of this should be taken as anything other than celebrating it. It's like Yogi Berra.
Right.
Yogi Berra was a Hall of Fame player, but he's also remembered for his endearing malaprops, which contained elements of truth in their own odd way. So these are just two that I remember from Mike and are seldom cited. This is sometime in the late 90s, and home runs were up around baseball, and Mike is on the air during the game, and he says, boy, the ball is really carrying tonight. During batting practice, that old horsehide was flying out of this ballpark like it had a date with pause, 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 pause. You know who. Yes, of course, Mike, we all know who. The baseball had a date with somebody. Now you realize that you've talked yourself into some cul-de-sac that you can't really get out of. And 5 seconds of dead air on the radio seems like an eternity. What? You know who.
You know who.
We all do. Of course we do.
Of
And
course.
there was another time Willie McGee gets picked off first base. And apparently Willie kind of slipped, and he was kind of stumbling back, and he's tagged out. And the call went something like this. Willie McGee was slipping and sliding like he was walking down an icy sidewalk in winter. But when he got there, the gendarmes was waiting to put the tag on him. Well, of course. That's just the way Vin Scully would have put it.
That's how it sounded. Thank you, Bob. Thank you so much.
Thanks,
See ya.
Bob.
Bob
Bye.
Costas.